Hi all, this is my 2021 Chevrolet Bolt EV, which is way more fun and fast to drive than it looks, but it has almost 45,000 miles on it, so it's definitely time to do some maintenance on it. So let's talk about how to do EV maintenance.
So to get started with EV maintenance, we're going to do the same step that we do for any vehicle, regardless of whether it's an internal combustion engine, hybrid, or EV. And that is to perform multi-point inspection. So that's, for the most part, pretty much the same as on any car. Check the horn, check lights, check the seat belts, check to make sure all the windows go up and down, all these kinds of different things. There are a few things we're not going to have to do, like obviously check engine oil, but there are three separate coolant loops that we do need to check, and that is a critical piece of the inspection process, and ensuring that this vehicle is going to be maintained and going to be safe and run for a long time. So let's get to it. Here we are under the hood, and as you can see, I have all the components labeled, and I use it in class, but also I'm planning on making another video for you guys just to kind of explain what all this stuff is. But aside from that, let's get back to our inspection. So you can see we have three coolant loops here, and this first one is for the cabin heat. This one here goes to the big battery, the high voltage battery, to keep that cool and warm. And this coolant loop here is for the inverter, converter that changes AC voltage to DC voltage, because all of those components need temperature control, and they can get very hot, and they don't work very well when they're very cold. So let's go ahead and get started with our heater. The heater's a good one to get started with because it's the least critical component and it's very easy to see. So we can see that it's overfilled a little bit, but this is from factory. It has not gone down since I've owned it. But if it gets below this line, then we know that there's a serious problem. Now, high voltage does go to this cabin heater right here. So if we have some sort of an internal leak, we could also potentially be allowing high voltage electricity to have a short. And as we know, high voltage and water do not really go well together, or we could say they go way too well together and cause a whole lot of problems. So if you have low coolant on any one of your reservoirs, then you need to take it to a technician to do what's called a pressure test, where we actually pressurize this and see where the leak is. Or if you're a technician yourself, then you're definitely going to want to explain how important it is to the customer that the pressure test be performed, and ensure that you perform the pressure test, but not above the rated cap pressure. These systems really can only handle about 5 psi. And if we go above that, then we're actually causing a leak instead of fixing one, which is, not exactly our goal as technicians. The next one we're going to take a look at is the high voltage battery coolant reservoir. As we all know, this is extremely important. The battery does need to be cooled and heated, but the coolant should never touch the high voltage battery cells. They are separate from each other. So if we see that this reservoir is even a little bit low, that could spell big problems. We're talking high voltage battery vehicle fire. And that is 100% very dangerous. So if we see that this reservoir is even a little bit low, we want to make sure that we're checking it to make sure that it does not have a coolant leak. But honestly, more than likely, if your coolant is low, there is some sort of a coolant failure, and that needs to be addressed right away. So this is not like your internal combustion engine where you just take the cap off and top it off a little bit, and it's okay unless you see that there's the whole coolant bottle is drained and shows that there could be a major coolant problem. This is definitely something you have to get checked out right away, and there's no need to top off the coolant, honestly, on any of these coolant loops. The inverter coolant reservoir is the same situation as the others. So if it's even just a little bit low, it's going to require some diagnosis because this coolant touches high voltage components. In this case, it's going to be your charger and your inverter. One big thing that a lot of people might neglect is to check the 12-volt battery. You might ask, if I have a 300-volt battery, why in the world do I need a 12-volt battery? Well, some of the obvious reasons are it turns your headlights on, your radio operates all of your interior accessories, including your ignition switch, right? Um, but the biggest thing is that your 12-volt battery is what operates the switch or the contactors slash relays, however you want to call it, to attach your high voltage battery to your electric motor, because we don't want to send high voltage to your electric motor all the time, only when you need to drive it. So if your 12-volt battery goes dead, your high voltage battery cannot send high voltage to your motor and you can't go anywhere. So before we get started on actually checking the battery, on a lot of EVs and possibly even some hybrids, there's a situation where we don't need the engine to be running in order to charge the battery. So now there's a chance that this battery right now, even while the car is off, could be charging, right? So before we test the battery, we want to make sure we can disconnect these cables so we can get, number one, an accurate reading, and number two, we want to make sure it's not in an active charging state so that we can safely disconnect these battery terminals. Now, there is a problem with disconnecting the negative battery terminals, right? You're clearing a lot of memory, a lot of radio presets, and also you don't want to leave these battery terminals disconnected for long periods of time, because the monitoring system that monitors the health of the high voltage battery, okay, is run off of this 12-volt battery. So if the battery is starting to overheat, it needs the coolant to be pumped through it to cool down. We can't do any of that stuff while the high voltage battery, while the 12-volt battery is disconnected. So if we're going to do this procedure, then we want to do it relatively quickly. Okay, so let's get started with just checking to see if we are in a charged state. I'm just going to use my good old Fluke multimeter here. Well, it's the school's, but same difference. Okay, so right now we're at 12.89 volts. Okay, maybe we're charging, maybe we're not. Let's see if maybe I just have a surface charge situation. So I'll go ahead and turn the headlights on for just a short period of time. That might end up encouraging the vehicle to go back into a charged state, but we'll give it a try. Okay, so now we're back down to 12.65 volts. So before this thing wants to start charging again, I'm going to disconnect this negative battery terminal first. Then I'll go ahead and disconnect the positive battery terminal, and then we can begin our battery test. Okay, so it looks here like we have a good battery, but potentially next year we'll see. We'll check it again before winter hits, which is always harder on batteries than summertime, and see how it does. Okay, so now we made it to the charge port. Technically, there is no maintenance for the charge port, but I like to just make sure that it's nice and clean. It can get exposed to, some dirt and debris, just like anything else on the car. We just want to be sure that when we're wiping it down, we're using a lint-free cloth. I just kind of grabbed an alcohol wipe. It's pretty convenient. And the goal is just to try to keep the dirt and debris out of these pins. So as you're wiping things down, just make sure stuff isn't falling down in there. And it's always nice for the customer to see that because they can open up their charge door and they see, oh, it's so nice and clean and shiny in there, and they feel well taken care of. And it's true, they will be well taken care of because this could potentially prevent a lot of charge problems. Okay, so the next step is to clean the actual pins inside of the charge connector. So this is kind of a big deal. Now, a lot of people don't do this or don't know about it, but what I like to do is use some of this deoxit spray, okay? And it's basically just an electrical contact cleaner. It helps to remove dirt and debris, but it also helps to lubricate the pins inside here so that when you're connecting and disconnecting, connecting and disconnecting, it happens much smoother, much easier, and will help to conduct electricity a little bit better. I just like to spray a little bit of the deoxit onto a small cleaning swab. So this is just something I got off of Amazon. You can use these things for cleaning keyboards, that kind of stuff, or in this case, cleaning the terminals or the pins on your charge port. You don't want to overdo it. We don't want to spray a whole bunch of the stuff in there. It is very expensive. And also, we don't want to make the mistake of accidentally conducting electricity between all of the pins when we're just trying to prevent stuff. So you can kind of see how dirty it's already gotten just by that. And this is after 45,000 miles. So you can imagine on, some of the older EVs that have been out there for a longer period of time, they might have some pretty dirty pins. Okay, so now this is clean. We got the charge door flap clean. We got all this clean. Don't forget about your DC to DC, your fast charging chargers or charging pins. Actually, you know what? This has gotten so dirty that I think I'm going to have to grab a new one. All right. I already sprayed it with the deoxit cleaner. Go ahead and finish cleaning up these terminals. I mean, you can just see the dirt on sides. Okay, there we go. So that definitely was a worthwhile additional step to do for an EV service.
For the cabin air filter, usually you'll find it's behind the glove box. One of the things I try to do when I remember is to grab a regular box just to put the contents of the glove box inside of it. That way I'm sure I don't lose anything, because the other alternative is just to drop everything on the floor mat, which is, a little bit sketchy there. To access the air filter behind the glove box, what you want to do is there's two plastic tabs behind each side, and so you'll just squeeze one side and then the other, and that way the glove box will lower. Sometimes it's a little tricky. Sometimes you'll see a strut as well. So this is just attached to a plastic pin on the side. So we just push the strut in and release the strut, and now the whole thing comes down. So there's your pin. Here's the hole where the pin attaches to on the bottom rung, and we'll hook that back up when we're done. Okay, so now we are behind the glove box. And in order to get to the cabin air filter here, right, we just squeeze these two little tabs. It comes out, and pull it to the right. Okay, and that's gonna release this little tab on the other end that is situated inside of this groove on the side here. Okay, so that's what we're looking to do. All right, now if you notice the cabin air filter, the arrows are pointing down. So basically we're taking in fresh air from the outside, putting it through the filter before it gets to this blower motor assembly right here. A nice little trick I learned from GM training is that you can take the new cabin air filter box, cut it into the shape of the air filter, slide it in under the old one, and then that way you have something to catch any kind of debris that might fall out while you're removing the cabin air filter. All right, it's a little tricky, but there you go. So that way catch a couple little things that might have otherwise fallen into the blower motor and be difficult to remove. Okay, so the rest of this is pretty easy. We just go ahead and pop our new air filter in. And of course we're trying to make note of our little arrow here. Sorry, it's a little tough to see. And luckily this one's a little easier because the lettering is actually facing the correct side and the arrow is pointing down. So that is perfect. And then we'll just go ahead and put our cover for the air filter back on. There we go. And we just push it into place. All done. Let's see, got a little bit of fuzz there, no problem. Okay, it's secure. We are good to go. Now we just put the glove box and everything else back in. Sometimes that can be a little bit tricky because you want to make sure that you get the strut into the correct position. So again, there's two holes on here and we're using the bottom one. And then now that the strut is in place, we can just go ahead and pop, push that glove box back in. And don't forget to put all the customer stuff back and keep your box handy for the next customer's use. And voila, all done.
When lifting an EV, it's really important to make sure that you're going to set your lift in the correct location. So in this situation, we're going to set it on the pinch welds. Now, on some vehicles, that can be a problem if you have high voltage cabling right nearby. What we don't want to set the lift on is the battery pack supports back here, okay? Because we don't want to run the risk of potentially damaging the battery pack frame. Now, obviously, it's very robust, and the chances of you actually hurting this battery pack is very slim. But in any case, we just don't want to take any chances. So on this vehicle, we're going to lift up the vehicle by the pinch welds in the back. And on the front, we're going to place the lift on this lift support. And you can also use the pinch weld, but I like to use this instead because it avoids bending any kind of plastic that might be near the pinch weld. Don't forget to take off any wheel locks before you raise the vehicle up in the air. Make sure the car is securely on the lift before you raise it up all the way. When it's about 6 inches off the ground, give it a good shake. Now we're going to check tires on an EV or a hybrid the same way that we would on a traditional gas engine vehicle. The situation with EV tires is that they're a little bit more expensive because they're low rolling resistance, and oftentimes shaving weight helps with the range of the vehicle. So they're going to omit a spare tire and instead put in self-sealing glue so that in case there's a puncture, the person can potentially drive a little bit farther until they can get to their next stop and have the tire replaced. So let's go ahead and check this. We do want to check it in 3 separate spots. So right here I've got 3 millimeters, another 3 millimeters, and on the back end here, ooh, that's looking very bad. Let me double check that. Okay, another 3 millimeters. We want to make sure to not get on top of the tread wear bars. And then we'll go ahead and rotate the tire around and just make sure that we're kind of seeing the same measurement all the way around the tire, all the way across. because tire wear often does tell us if there's another problem going on. So another thing I'm going to do is just kind of rub my hand across, just kind of see if there's any excessive wear on the inside or the outside. Looks like it's pretty evenly worn, but I know that since I'm in the yellow, I'm right at about the 3 millimeter mark here. Oh, you probably can't see that. Let's give that another shot. Nope, not going to happen. Okay, well, anyway, we're in the yellow. So that means that it's time for me to start saving up for a couple paychecks to get some new tires. New tires on this without mountain balance, it's probably going to run me somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 bucks. So pretty good chunk of change. Of course, the other thing we want to do before we take the tire off is just go ahead and gently shake it left to right. Make sure there's no loose tie rod ends involved. Up and down, check ball joints all the way around. If there's play all the way around the tire, then we may have a bad wheel bearing that needs to be replaced. But in this case, we're good to go, everything's set, and we're ready to take the tires off. Since we're going to be doing a tire rotation, we want to make sure that we're going to put these tires exactly where we want them to be at the end. This way, once you're done with your brakes, you know that these tires are going to go right where you put them, and you don't have to worry about whether you're rotating the tires or if you're accidentally putting them right back in the same position as they were before. Also, be sure not to leave a tire underneath one of the lift arms, because if you have to get inside the vehicle later on for some reason and you lower the vehicle down on top of the tire, you're compressing somewhere around 35 to 40 pounds of air, and that could end up being a safety hazard. At very best, you're damaging the wheel. Okay, so if we take a look at the brake pad lining right here, we can see pretty easily that this is almost a full pad. In 44,000 miles, it has not worn down much at all. So you might be asking the question, why are we taking the caliper off, taking the brake pads off, lubricating everything, and putting the old pad back on? Well, as you can see, number one, it's not really worn. But it's not worn because the brakes on EVs and hybrids don't get used very often. So it's not unusual for a hybrid or EV to go about 100,000 miles before you need to replace the front brake pads. Not even to mention the rear brakes are not used as much as the front. And so that wear is going to be even less. So the problem it creates is that since this caliper is not moving in and out very often, it has the possibility of becoming frozen. And when it becomes frozen, then you run into more problems later on, uneven braking during certain conditions, and just general wear and tear problems. So I'm just trying to avoid that. And so we're going to go ahead and service both the front and rear brakes. This may not be something that a customer would want to pay for normally, but if you know that the price for, let's say, a new caliper bracket or a new caliper is astronomical on a particular vehicle, it might be worth doing this service just to save them a little bit of money down the road. Okay, so here's the brake caliper bracket right here. And a couple things I noticed is there wasn't a whole lot of dust, and I was able to just get rid of all the dust with just wiping it off with a rag. The reason being, I think, is okay, yes, we're not really doing a whole lot of braking with EVs and hybrids, but these brake pad retention springs or retainer springs have what looks to be a coating on them. So I'm hesitant to put any kind of brake parts lubricant on there, like we typically do in the field. But I am tempted to put a little bit on there just because I can see that there's some small wear spots right inside there. You can probably see them. They're a little bit shiny, two little rectangles in there. because that coating has worn away in that area. So I'll probably just put a couple little dabs here. But if I had new springs, I'd just put new springs in there. If they had the coating, I would not put any lubricant on them because it basically, the coating will act sort of as a lubricant, is my thinking here, and you wouldn't need to put any extra lubricant on there. Now for the guide pins, there's, of course, already a pretty good amount of lube there, but I tend to feel like a little bit more would be best because these do feel just a little bit on the dry side. So I'm going to go ahead and just put a moderate amount. We don't want to overdo it, right? Because that can actually cause the exact problem that we're trying to avoid, which is the caliper not sliding as smoothly as it should and brakes binding and causing a pull to the right or to the left. Okay, so we'll just kind of put a medium, I guess we could call it, amount of the ceramic brake lube here. Okay. All right, make sure that's plugged in. And I'll do the same to the other side as well, and we'll be ready to rock and roll. Also, of course, with brake caliper pins, just make sure that you put them back in the right spot because, as you can see, this one is a little bit different than the other. One critical mistake that a lot of people make when putting brakes back together is to reuse the caliper bracket and sometimes even the caliper bolts. So as you can see here, this is a caliper bracket bolt that I took out of the car, and it comes with preloaded thread locker so that when they assemble it at the assembly plant, the brake caliper bracket won't expand and contract through all the braking action and potentially cause the caliper to fall off. So that would definitely be a major mistake. Now, the goal of any manufacturer is when a repair or a maintenance procedure is being done, is to bring the vehicle back to factory specs. So this is the factory spec. Now, a lot of people just aren't going to want to spend $5 per bolt on new caliper brackets, caliper bracket bolts every time they do a brake job. Okay, understandable, right? So I forgot to get new bolts, and probably a common situation you may be in at some point. So I cleaned off all the old thread locker, and I'm going to go ahead and install a liberal amount of blue thread locker, about 2/3 of the threads. And I want it to be, pretty decently coated because I do not want my caliper falling off. And I'm sure that if you have customers, loyal customers, they are not really looking forward to that either. So go ahead and coat your caliper bracket bolt. Okay. And then we can go ahead and reinstall it. Another really common mistake is that people just tend to not really torque anything. So this caliper bracket has a torque of 118 pound-feet, and the caliper bolts themselves have a torque of 30 pound-feet. After dusting off the brake pads, we go ahead and install them. Don't want to forget our springs. Keeps the pads spread out, prevents them from sticking. And we go ahead and put the caliper on. And since we didn't replace the pads, we should not have to depress the brake pad caliper. Or shouldn't have to depress the caliper piston, that's what I meant. These caliper bolts don't have any factory Loctite on them, so they're good to go just as is. And last but not least, we go ahead and torque our caliper bolts to 30 pound-feet. So you might be asking why I didn't bother to take the rotor off and clean any rust or anything that might be behind here. Two reasons. One, when I took the caliper off, everything looked pretty good and pretty clean. So I'm not really too concerned about rust behind there. But I don't live in the Rust Belt. But if I did live in the Rust Belt, Pennsylvania, New York, these places, I would definitely take the rotor off, clean, and even lubricate the wheel hub before I put the brake rotor on, caliper bracket, caliper, the whole nine. Oftentimes, if you're working on any newer vehicle, even if it's a internal combustion engine car and definitely a hybrid or an EV, you'll have to go and use the scan tool, enter into like a safe brake service mode, or retract the rear caliper pistons because there's an electric motor on the back side of this caliper. So in order to depress that piston back, in order to fit a new set of pads in there, you need to electronically tell this caliper to pull back and open up. Otherwise, you're going to cause severe damage, and unfortunately, you may be buying a new caliper. Now, for my personal vehicle, since I'm only lubricating things, I'm going to go ahead and give it a try and just go ahead and take the caliper off, lubricate everything, put it back, see how it goes. Now, even with that, I'm probably going to have to go ahead and go into the scan tool and recalibrate my parking brake because this electronic caliper is also your parking brake. So we'll give it a shot. Now, on some hybrid and electric vehicles, you want to be very, very careful because whenever you open the door or turn the key in the on position or even get close to the car with the key fob, there's a chance this brake caliper might self-actuate and actually clamp down potentially on your hand while you're working on the car. In that situation, best case scenario is that there's a problem with the caliper and you have to replace it. Worst case scenario, you get injured. So definitely read service information ahead of time to just make sure that there's no special precautions when performing either a front or rear brake job. Be sure to tighten all the lug nuts on all the wheels. The best way to do that is with a torque wrench. On this particular vehicle, it's 100 pound-feet, but depending on what you're working on, it could be anywhere from 60 all the way up to 200. After any brake job, you want to make sure that you gently depress the brake pedal a few times just to make sure that there's enough fluid going to the brake calipers. Actuate the parking brake to make sure it works. And last but not least, perform a test drive just to make sure everything's okay.